Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm Jenna Seery, associate producer and bookseller here with Barnes & Noble, and today I am so excited to be with Lev Grossman, the author of The Magicians, which I'm sure many of you have read, maybe watched the TV show as well. But today we're here to talk about The Bright Sword, and this is something that I have been truly waiting for because any chance I can get to talk about Arthur is one I'm going to take. So thank you so much for being here.
It's so good to be here. It's good to be back in New York City, where I haven't been for a year and a half. You kept it warm for me?
We certainly did.
Yeah, so that's good.
Well, I think the best place to start with this is, since we all know the story of Arthur, but there's some things that are a little bit different in this telling, and I wonder if you could just set the book up for us. I will say we're not going to do spoilers, so anyone who hasn't read the book yet, don't worry. But there are some things that you'll know pretty quick as you go through.
Well, of course, when you're going to retell the Arthur story, you want to do some things the same and some things different. And I would say the big thing that I did differently with The Bright Sword is that I kind of, in many ways, it's very classic, but I did sort of widen the lens so that we look at not only Arthur's lifetime, but the period of time after his death. You look for the blank spots on the map. I often think about T.H. White and the incredible thing he did with Sword in the Stone, which was to write Arthur's childhood. Nobody had ever written that story about Arthur as a kid. And all that stuff about Merlin and getting changed into animals, he just made it up, and it was wonderful. And I thought to myself, well, where else is blank? And I thought about the time after Arthur's death. And at first it seemed dull because there was no Arthur in it. But I realized, and I looked more closely at that world that he was in. And the first thing I realized was Arthur's death was unquestionably going to set off a really terrible succession crisis because he had no kids, except for Mordred, who was problematic in many ways. And I thought about the idea of Arthur's world, which revolved around Arthur. He was the sun at the center of everything. And then the sun goes out and the world becomes dark and it begins to break into pieces and devolve into chaos. And what would that look like? I thought it would look cool. And I became very interested in it. It felt something about it resonated with the place we are right now in the world, which is the object. Arthur obviously is a figure from the distant past, but when you tell his story, it's always really about this moment that we're in. So I became very interested in Arthurless Britain, and then I had another panic attack because I realized I went back to Malory, to the Morte d'Arthur, and I realized that almost everybody is dead. The Camlan is just an unmitigated disaster. Not only does Arthur die, and Mordred, but almost literally every other knight in the Round Table. There's literally 6 or 7 knights left, and at first I thought that would be a really big problem. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. It's not the heroes anymore. We've lost Gawain, we've lost Gareth, there's no Tristram, there's no Lionel, there's no Galahad, there's Lancelot, but he's retired in a monastery. What a wonderful opportunity to look at some of the people who are traditionally pushed to the margins of the Arthur story, and to take them and to usher them into the center of the stage and to tell their stories. And that's really where The Bright Sword begins. And we do a lot of stuff. There's a lot of flashing back. At least half the book is set during Arthur's reign, and we're looking back from the vantage point of the world after Arthur, looking back at his kind of rise and fall and seeing how it looks different. But the heart of the book, I think, is that story about the knights who are left over, who are the survivors, and whose job it is to try to put Britain back together.
And what a ragtag crew they are. A group that I think most of us would not necessarily want on our side in every battle, except once you get to know them, you really see how they work together and how they come to be a pretty formidable group in their own way. But I think our window into this story is Colum, and he is truly an outsider, just as we are, and he's learning all these things about court and about being a knight as we all are going along on his story with him. And I wonder how you sort of came to his voice and came to know that he was going to be a big part of the story.
I came to Colum very slowly. if you are familiar at all with the Arthurian stories, a common trope of the Arthur story is an unknown but handsome young man turning up at the gates of Camelot, very interested in joining the Round Table. It happens a lot. And so I thought, let's look at one of these young men. But in many ways, Colum is an outsider who is not really supposed to be there, partly because his birth, his origin is uncertain at best, very murky. There's a lot of PR about the Round Table and how equitable it is, but most of the knights are of noble, if not royal, blood. Colum is not. And the other thing about Colum is that he is from the north. I don't know when to do a sidebar about the historical King Arthur, but if King Arthur was, is it now? Is this
it's now.
Moment? If we don't know if King Arthur was real or not, but if he was real, he would have lived in the 6th century AD, which is a really long time ago, and that is a little interregnum between the departure of the Romans, who were in charge of Britain for 3.5 centuries. I learned so much when I was researching that book. I don't think I knew that when I started. Britain was a province of the Roman Empire for a very long time, and then the Romans left in a great big hurry because they had some domestic problems that needed seeing to. And then there was a strange time when the Romans having left, the Romans were sort of like aliens from an advanced civilization when they arrived in Britain. Britain was still in the Iron Age, and the Romans came in and they had all this stuff. They had glass, and they knew how to write and read, and they could mint coins, and they could make fancy pottery and dressed stone, so that everything that they built looked fancy and cool. And when they left, Britain fell back. It was like I Am Legend. All the Roman stuff fell into ruins, and they forgot everything that the Romans had brought. No coins were minted in Britain for hundreds of years after the Romans left because no one remembered. No one threw pottery on the wheel because they forgot how to do it, and they treasured these bits of Roman pottery that were left over because they couldn't remember how to do it. The Romans leave, and then the Saxons come. There's a tiny interregnum. I mean, there's never really a little moment where there's no Saxons, but there's a bit where the Celts are kind of in charge, the indigenous British, and then the Saxons come and ruin everything. But there's a little time when the Celts are in charge of their own country again, and they're trying to keep the Saxons out. And the guy in charge of keeping Saxons out of Britain is Arthur. That's who Arthur is. So Colum is from the north. The north is relatively un-Romanized. The Romans had a really hard time in the north, which is why they built a big wall, so that people from the north couldn't come south. But they still laid claim to it. Colum is from the Out Isles, which is an evocative Arthurian place name, loosely identified with the Hebrides. I have solidly identified it with the Hebrides. So Colum is a northerner. And the thing about Camelot and Arthur is that they are very Roman identified. These are, the historians call the kind of person that Arthur was a Romanized Briton, so he was a Celt, he was British, but he'd taken on the ways of the Romans. He spoke Latin, he was probably a Christian, he was definitely a Christian. But there were plenty of people in Britain who found that distasteful. And they certainly found it was unpopular in the north. They hated the Southrons. They were not Christians up there. They were pagan. So when Colum comes south, he's an oddity because there aren't a lot of northern knights poking around. And also, Colum is poor and not noble. He has stolen a suit of armor and he's pretending to be more noble than he actually is. And then he's sort of our eyes and ears, really, because he's the outsider who comes in and we follow him.
And watching his lens of the world is very interesting because he gives us a lot of his thoughts as well, I think, which is very fun to go along with. But since we went on that sidebar, I feel like I have to go into the research that you did for this book because there is a wide variety of sort of opinion, I guess, on this period of time in Britain. And many different people have written their thoughts. And I think there's also a difference between what we often see in literature and what we see in history for this time as well, because the sort of Morte d'Arthur sort of set a precedent for many different things that would come to follow, whether or not they were completely historically accurate. So I'd love to sort of hear about the research that you did and how you came to your choices in the book.
I will definitely tell you. The weird thing about Arthur, when we think about Arthur, or when I think about Arthur, I mostly think about the once and future King Arthur, the Malory Arthur, the Camelot Arthur, of the shining armor and the soaring towers and the tournaments and all that stuff. That's very different from the historical Arthur, who lived in that interregnum, which, by the way, that was the Dark Ages. That's what we call the Dark Ages. Those 200 years, 400 to 600, where there was no shining armor happening back there. It was very gritty. In the high medieval period, when they told stories about Arthur, they dressed him up like a high medieval king, and they gave him all these high medieval trappings, which were very ahistorical, but we really like them. When you have a writer like, for example, Bernard Cornwell, who is a genius, or Mary Stuart, also a genius, when they wrote about Arthur, they stripped away all that medieval stuff and took him back to his historical roots. I didn't do that. One of the things that there's been a trend recently to have some very hard-boiled Arthurs, and people strip away the shining armor and they strip away the magic. And I wanted to lean the other way. I wanted a very romantic Arthur. I wanted to have the magic and the armor and the cool swords and the fairies. I wanted a lot of fairies in there. So I leaned really the other way and went with the medieval Arthur, who is very anachronistic, which is a long way of saying that there's a ton of historical detail in this book, which took me a very long time to assemble. And yet, still with all that work, it's very historically inaccurate, because that's who Arthur is. Arthur is a kind of mashup of a lot of different periods of British history. So I took a lot of Dark Ages geopolitics, and I took a lot of medieval weaponry and armor and the cool stuff. I don't know. I mean, when you're writing, you can take what you like, basically, because Arthur is never going to be too historically rigorous.
And you do a lot with the knights in this story as well, to sort of shape them into characters that have a little bit more depth to them, and we really get to know them as people, and you've made some choices there. And I think some people out in the audience here are wondering how you made those choices to really imbue different personalities into the knights as well, without spoiling anything.
I took almost 10 years to write this book, which means that some aspects of its composition I no longer remember. And came very early on in the process. But I do remember choosing the knights that I pick and chose who I liked. I liked Palomides, for example. I may be saying that wrong. Palomides is a Muslim knight, and he is he's in most versions of Arthur. There is a Palomides. No, but nobody has ever really explained what he's doing there. Where did he come from, and how did he get to Britain? I very badly wanted to know. So, as it happens, Palomides is one of the surviving knights after the Battle of Camelot. So I was excited to take him and write his backstory and find out where he came from. Some of these knights, they just had been kicking around in my mind for a while. Sir Dagonet. Sir Dagonet is the court jester at Camelot. And one day, for reasons that are very hard to parse out, Arthur thought that it would be funny to knight Dagonet and to give him a place on the round table, even though he didn't really know how to ride a horse or use a sword. He was sort of comic relief. And again, Dagonet gets no lines in the Morte d'Arthur. I always wonder, what was he feeling? What was that like? Probably was not entirely pleasant.
Well, maybe there's on-the-job training to be a knight. I mean, you can learn as you go.
Dagonet, he's a sad clown. I'm going to just spoil that for you. He's not a happy clown. So some of these guys are just oddities that I loved. Sir Bedivere. Bedivere is one of the oldest figures from Arthurian romance. If you go back very far to the oldest Welsh tales, Bedivere is there. And Sir Kay is always there. Sir Kay is not even a jerk yet. He's just a regular guy. He becomes one later. And Bedivere is there. And Bedivere is always very handsome. And the detail is always there that he has one hand. And he is very close with Arthur. And it's kind of sort of like his body man. He's always there with Arthur to make sure everything's going okay. Again, this is a guy who's standing in the background for every photo of Arthur ever taken has Bedivere in the background. But again, I wanted to know, and again, it was something. Bedivere's never the hero, and I wanted to make him a hero.
I also have to ask, it's related to the knights. One of my favorite things and my favorite pieces of research that you did is about the fight the fight writing, the fight choreography that you did, because there are a lot of battles in the Bright Sword. That's not a spoiler, just so you know. There's a lot of fighting. There's lances, there's swords, there's punching. So I really just wanted to know, how did you write those scenes?
Those are scenes which are meant to be read quickly, and anybody who has written any fiction will know that the scenes that flow fast take the longest to write. And the fight scenes took a very long time, and there's a lot of moving parts. And yet, the older I get and the shorter my attention span gets, the more magic and fighting I need in my books. So there's a lot. It's challenging. I personally am a man of peace. I haven't done a lot of pitched battles myself.
Not yet.
So I spend a lot of time reading first-person accounts, of which there are surprisingly many, of being a knight in a battle. Reading great battle scenes, like, for example, the ones in War and Peace, which are Napoleonic battles, but they're just remarkable the way he sort of deconstructs them, and it conveys the utter disorientation and terror of being in a battle. Trivia alert, I was named after Tolstoy. Many years I didn't read War and Peace because I was resented being named after Tolstoy. But he's a really good writer, as it turns out. And his battle scenes are amazing. I read Joe Abercrombie. Any Joe Abercrombie fans out there? Ugh, love Joe Abercrombie. I'm friendly with George R. R. Martin, and what George and I talk about when we see each other is we mostly talk about Joe Abercrombie, because we're two huge Joe Abercrombie fans, and his battles are astounding. The way that he works out the choreography and the tactics and the weapon work and everything. And lastly, I did a little training myself. I took a couple of longsword classes. We are in a real a time when medieval fighting is like coming into its own. People have really done the research, which they hadn't done 20 years ago, about how knights actually fought and what was that martial art that they practiced. We know T.H. White knew almost nothing about this stuff. And anytime I can steal a march on T.H. White, I will do it. And now we know a great deal about it. And I actually spent a long time, and I had two life-size plastic, but life-size swords that I kept in my writing studio, and I would try to pace out how the fighting went. And hopefully it translates into something that feels visceral and feels like that you can see what's happening. That was the hope.
Did you try to get the swords through customs into the U.S. from Australia?
The swords stay in the United States. I didn't. Okay. It's harder to get things into Australia.
That's true.
And you don't want to be turned back because you just spent 24 hours on a plane.
Karen and I had a similar thought here. Wondering, to end off this section here on research, if you had like a favorite fact that you learned while you were doing this.
I have a few. It's interesting trying to do this kind of research because you are working with historians and historical books, but you're not a historian yourself. You're a novelist, and you're looking for different things than this. You're interested in different things than the historians are interested in. So you want to know the little details of daily life, what the knights have for breakfast, for example. Mostly they don't have breakfast, as it turns out. Breakfast was
not the most important meal of the day.
No, it was considered to be for the week.
Write that down.
But and you'd read an entire book, and you'd come away with one little detail from the middle of it, which was just absolutely priceless. For example, the fact that pillows. When were pillows invented? When did they become popular? Well, as it turns out, we didn't always have pillows. And in the early medieval period, especially if you were poor, you didn't have pillows. So what did you put your head on when you lay down to sleep? As it turns out, you put it on a log. Everybody had their own sleeping log. I don't know what they called it. But you could just, once you do that, when you know that they have their heads on logs, suddenly you could picture what it feels like to be a medieval person trying to get to sleep without a proper pillow. I remember reading Distant Mirror, which is Barbara Tuchman, I think. And she has a description of someone going to a church, and it's during the Anarchy, which was a period of civil war in Britain, and the rose window of the church was smashed, and the person describes the rain sort of gusting in and falling on this deconsecrated altar. You just think, yes, ka-ching, I'm going to use that. And the last thing I'll say is that the knights, apparently they grew their hair long. They like to grow it to shoulder length. And they did that so that when they go put on their armor, they could pin up their hair and have it on top of their head as a little additional cushioning between their head and the helmet. When I read that in a book by Ewart Oakeshott, I immediately thought of the converse, which is what, at the end of the day, they take their helmet off, they're all sweaty, and they unpin their hair, and it falls to their shoulders. Okay, I mean, it feels like you're in the same room with them, suddenly.
Yes. I think we're missing a Bright Sword merch opportunity of Bright Sword sleeping logs. I think could be good. I know that there's a lot of Magicians fans in the audience, and I think that something that struck me as I was reading Bright Sword in comparison to the Magicians is sort of this idea of really incredible fantasy taking place at moments of transition. And this is obviously very much relevant in the Bright Sword. We're definitely sort of having the opportunity for lots of new ideas and new mythologies and mixing with old. And I think that comes up in Magicians as well, this idea that things are in flux and things are changing for our characters, and what can that bring? And I wonder what your feelings and thoughts are about writing in transition, especially when it comes to fantasy or this sort of fantastical.
One of the things that is not unique but unusual about Arthur's world, and one of the things that I most love about it, is the fact, this is maybe an obvious thing to point out, but that there are two kinds of magic in this world. There's the magic of the fairies and the enchanters, the druids, essentially, the indigenous magical practice of the British. And then there's God. There's the Christian God, who is in the Arthur story. He's not a distant God. He's very close. He's right there with the knights. There's not a question of whether there's a real God. There's definitely God, because he's always sticking his oar in and sending marvels and miracles and things like that. It has this woven quality where there's this sort of the warp of the fairies and the weft of the divine running through this world. And I think that very often people try to keep them apart, and they'll have one or the other. But to have both and have them touching and interacting, it's an amazing, wonderful thing. And if you are wondering if at any point in the book they have a big fight, I can tell you that they do have a big fight. And we'll see who wins.
There are many moments of big fights, so those of you who are ready for that, buckle up. I think another thing that I love so much about the Bright Sword is this idea of seeking adventure and always ready for the next thing and wondering how do we, keep moving forward. And I think so often we're looking for how we can relate things to what we're all experiencing now. And I think genre fiction is a great way for us to sort of process through really present struggles and concerns without it feeling too close. And I know that some of you are wondering as well how you feel about telling an Arthur story in this time.
Necessary for me to feel like Arthur still had something to say to this moment that we're in. Arthur is a straight, white, middle-aged, rich guy. We've all heard a lot from those people recently. Do we need to hear any more? And so it took me a while of writing to feel as though that there were aspects of Arthur and Arthur's world that resonated with our own. Certainly, you hear a lot in the book about the dividedness of Britain between British and Roman and pagan and Christian and North and South and many other axes. And the dividedness of Britain, it reminded me of something. Reminded me of the United States and how divided against, and the way in which that division is rooted in history. It's rooted in this history of violence and inequality, historical crimes that are still unprocessed and undealt with. And the way they make themselves felt in the present is through division. And I think that is something that we struggle with, and Arthur struggled with too. That was the big thing for me that I felt resonate. And then, of course, as I alluded earlier, there's the whole post-apocalypticness of it.
Ah, yes.
This idea that these characters are living in a world that has lost its way and lost its center, and it's a darkened world, and God has retreated, and Arthur is gone, and who's going to show them the way? And that feeling of lostness it's something I recognize without being able to quite put my finger on why I feel it now the way they felt it then, but I recognized it.
I would say this is a hopeful story, though. I think it'd be very easy for a story like this to become pretty bleak, since there are a lot of struggles and there are a lot of challenges, and maybe some of them seem divine and unconquerable. But we managed to keep a lot of hope going here.
It is a petty writer who responds to his reviews, and so I'm going to have a tiny moment of pettiness.
Mm-hmm.
The New York Times read a fantastic review about The Bright Sword today. I mean, not only was it a favorable review, but it was extremely insightful and well written, and really very much got at what the whole project of the book was. But they did depict it as quite a bleak book. Depression was alluded to on a number of occasions, and certainly there are great struggles in this book. But the reason why I wanted to extend the story past Arthur's death is that the story of Arthur always stops at his death. The Morte d'Arthur, the death of Arthur. The label says what's in the tin. It always ends there. And the idea that we could take the story and keep it going, and rather than just stopping and mourning the loss of the glory that was Camelot, moving forward and thinking, how do you live in this world where the greatest thing in it is gone? Because you have to, and you can. And there is a message of hope there. There absolutely is, along with all the depression. There's absolutely a feeling of hope, and not just looking back at what was, even though it was really great, but looking forward as to where things are going to go. And
I think that I would say, even looking back to The Magicians and some of your other work, there is less cynicism, I think, apparent here. And it could just be that this book took so long that you're like, I gotta keep going for the next thing. But the voice here, I think, is very different in tone in a great way. I think maybe part of that comes from, The Magicians is written for a little bit younger of an audience, and this is really a little bit more mature of a book. But I wonder how you felt you grew. And I think a lot of the audience members are wondering as well, sort of how your writing style has changed from the days of The Magicians into the days of Bright Sword.
That is such a good question.
Uh-oh.
And the reason I know is that I don't know the answer. Quentin, in The Magicians, he certainly struggles a lot with depression. He's not wholly mentally well. And yet, if you follow his journey all the way to the end of The Magician's Land, you do realize that he has gone on a journey and gotten to a new place. And Colum's journey is different. Colum, although he has suffered terribly, he is very mentally robust. I remember a moment, I'm going to now tell you more than you want to know, when I was in therapy, which I was in therapy for a long time, and I remember feeling as though I was worried that I was getting too well. Like, what am I going to write about if I feel good, like, a lot of the time? And my therapist, who's probably very tired of hearing this, said, well, look, you'll never forget. You'll never forget what it was like to feel the way that you did. I think that Colum is fundamentally a mentally healthy person, and one of the ways that you see that is this is a book much more about what's happening in the world and less about what's happening in Colum. Plenty of stuff happens inside Colum, but I think for the characters in The Magicians, they were working so hard to become themselves, to go from essentially adolescence to being adults. Here, a lot of the characters are older. Really, Colum is the main young person who's part of the story. It's really not about him pulling himself together. It's about the world trying to recover from what's troubling it. So it's a more outward-looking book, and I think as a result, quite different in tone from The Magicians. I think people will be pleasantly surprised by the ways in which the books contrast.
I think they will as well. But if you're looking for that same humor and the same approach to things from The Magicians, don't worry. The Bright Sword's got you covered still.
There's one guy who's really depressed.
Yes.
It's not Colum, but you'll know him when you meet him.
It's not a spoiler. I think structurally you get to have a lot of fun in this book as well. The sort of ability you have to work in these smaller chunks of time going back and forth, and there's sort of these little myths and stories that you weave in as well. Did you have this all set up? Did you have like a board where you were moving pieces around? Did you write it straight through? How was the writing on the sort of different timelines?
I mentioned about the 10 years.
Yes.
It took a long time. And it's funny because I was thinking the other day that the very first draft of the book, mostly the same things happen, but there was a question of emphasis, and there was a question of the moving back and forth in time and how those pieces, where those shifts came. A big inspiration for this book was Station 11. Probably a lot of people have read Station 11. And one of the many gorgeous things that she does in that book is to move backwards and forwards across this moment in time where everything falls apart. And we see the world before it fell, and we see the world after. And we see how they sort of chime and echo with each other. And it's something I tried to do here as well. That was sort of the model structurally. I also was thinking about the Canterbury Tales a lot. There's a lot of tales in this book, and the idea is that you feel a through line going forward all the time, even when you've moved backward in time, because you're learning the things you need to know to understand the world that you're in and the people you're with. But that sense of a kind of a miscellany was something I was attracted to just because it felt so much of that time.
I have a question in here, a couple of questions really about world building, and if you have any tips, tricks, your thoughts on really building a complete world, because I think that's something that comes through very much in The Bright Sword. There's so much detail, and it never feels like doing your homework. You really find ways to bring us into these fun facts without just dumping a bunch of information, and I think that especially in a historical setting like this, it can be a little tough to get that balance between the things that we all need to know in order to have a good time reading it, but still having the good time reading it.
I'm terrible at talking about world building. It's a really difficult topic, and yes. I tend to write straight through, thinking as little as possible about world building on the first pass, learning what the story needs, because the story, it is ultimately there to serve the story and to be the setting for it, but it can't feel like that. It has to feel like the story is making its way in spite of the world. And so there's a lot of push and pull, basically. You have to end with something that feels seamless and continuous. But what really happens, if I'm lifting the hood, you do your first world-building pass, and you think of lots of cool ideas, and then you see how they all break the plot. And so you have to move backwards again and see how you can make it how you can make it feel whole, and have the story sort of wend its way through this world you're making. Something I struggled with a lot was the pagan part of the world. Pagans didn't call themselves pagans. I never really thought of a good word for what pagans. Pagan is a Roman slur, and they must have had other names for themselves, which we don't know what they are. But pagan magic, it was different. It's not magician's magic. It is some of it's magician's magic, but some of it, a lot of it, is kind of transactional. The world of the pagans was densely populated with spirits and deities, and you would have a god. There's a big mountain over there. There's a god. The mountain's a god, and there's a river's a god, and that really big tree, that's also a god. The gods were thick on the ground, and there were many, many of them. And when you did magic, a large part of what you did was to negotiate with them. And you would have relationships with certain spirits. You may have done favors for them in the past. Now it's time for them to do you a favor. It was this complicated web of relationships that frankly gave me fits. But we know very little about pagan beliefs because they were very rarely written down. And the Romans did a very thorough and just awful job of killing all the druids, which they did. There's just heartbreaking scenes in contemporary accounts of the extermination of the druids. And the point about being a druid was you trained for decades and mastered this enormous body of lore and held it in your head. And then when they died, that all died with them. So we do our best to reconstruct, but it's from tiny, tiny fragments.
And some of our best reconstructions and most interesting, I think, reflections of those types of magic in this book are our female characters, Morgan Le Fay and Nimue, who I think have had many facets over the years. And there's many ways to write these characters and many different roles that they've played in different legends. But your characters are very fun and they get to really shine and have their own moments. And I wonder what writing those characters was like for you.
Each of them in different ways. There's three very prominent women in the Bride story, and it's Nimue, who was Merlin's apprentice, and Morgan Le Fay, who was Arthur's half-sister. When Uther married Igraine, and that was Arthur's father and mother, Igraine was already married. So Uther arranged for the death of Igraine's husband, and then Merlin, like the awesome guy that he is, transformed Uther into the seeming of Igraine's husband, and he went in and seduced her, and she thought that he was her husband when her husband was actually dead. Some really terrible things happen in this world. Morgan is a child of the first marriage, of Igraine's first marriage, so Arthur's half-sister has a very complicated, ambivalent relationship to Arthur. And Guinevere, who of the three, they were all wonderful to write, but Guinevere may be my favorite because I feel she's so often ill-served. You know, she's everybody's Achilles heel. All the men's Achilles heel is Guinevere, right. And she herself has very little agency, and seems to not even have a good sense of what's happening and the consequences of her actions, and she just gets carried around, you know, like a sack of laundry. It was very important to me that Guinevere be strong, and that Guinevere be the most intelligent person in Britain, which she definitely was. And she sees, maybe even more than Arthur, everything that's happening, and even takes control every once in a while. She's a great favorite of mine. And then there's Morgan, she's a Celt. She's not Romanized. She's unromanized. She is she is descended of the Iron Age royalty, and kind of comes from Cornwall, which was not the Romans never really managed to conquer. So she's the voice of this very aggrieved, oppressed Britain, and I sometimes had trouble with her taking over the book. Because people had to argue with her, and she was always right. And so sometimes it was very difficult to balance things. And then there's Nimue, who everybody loves Nimue. All King Arthur writers love Nimue because she's such an excellent character. She's Merlin's apprentice, but she's better at magic than him. And it comes out because they have a big fight, and Nimue wins. How fantastic. In the tradition, and I'm looking at you, T.H. White, even he makes it kind of Nimue's fault that Merlin falls in love with her and harasses her to the point where she has to fight back. And it's because of her feminine wiles. You can't blame Merlin for that because Nimue is so beguiling. Anyway, obviously there's a new story to be told there, and it's a good one.
I can't wait for you to meet all those characters because I think you're going to love them as much as I do. But I know that we were going to end up sort of bumping up against time and running out, and I wanted to make sure there's time for everyone to get their books signed. But I have to ask before we end, what's next for you? Every author's favorite question.
I'm always very unfiltered in these conversations, so I'm just going to tell you the actual truth. I'm working on a graphic novel. I was developing a TV show for a long time. It was something that I was working on with the Russo brothers, who did the Avengers movies and lots of other cool stuff. And we worked on it, and Amazon bought it, and then they didn't make it, and they killed it. But we had done so much good work with all the characters in the world building, and I really wanted to see this stuff. So we repackaged it as a graphic novel. In the great tradition of writers being paid as many times as possible for the same idea, we resold it as a graphic novel, which we are now working on, and that is really, it's going to be good. And then I've started a new book, which I don't want to talk about too much, in part because something that I have noticed about my own writing is that when I am at the beginning of a project, it always sounds like a terrible idea. I'm just not able to express why I think it's a good idea. So I'm just going to say it. It's about a detective who is also a Greek god.
Perfect.
I don't know. I promise you it's going to turn into something, but it's not anything yet.
I think depending on which god, we could have a lot of different books on our hands.
It could go a lot of different
there's
ways.
a lot in there. But thank you so much, Lev Grossman,
Thank
for
you.
being with us today.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.